Every amateur cyclist makes the exact same mistake. We look at what the professionals are doing, the intervals, the training camps, the altitude training, the brutal efforts, and we think that's the secret. But here's the twist. The secret isn't the suffering, it's the restraint. In this episode, I sit down with Christian Schrot, performance coach at Team Jayco AlUla, and explore the truth behind one of endurance sports' most counterintuitive principles. Riding easy makes you fast. We dug into the science and the misconceptions around 80-20 polarized training model. We talk about what amateurs can and can't copy from the pros, and why zone discipline is non-negotiable, and how even the best riders in the world still struggle with one simple command: go slow. If you've ever second-guessed whether you're training hard enough or wondered if you can really get faster by backing off the gas, this episode is your permission slip and your roadmap. Because the truth is, if you're doing it right, most of your training should feel almost embarrassingly easy. Christian, welcome to the Roadmap Podcast.
Thanks, Anthony. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm pleased.
Every amateur looks at what the pros are doing. In this Instagram era, especially when I'm looking if they're at an altitude camp, I'm thinking to myself, how can I reverse engineer this? What elements, in your view, of a pro rider's training plan can amateurs actually copy, and which parts of it are completely inappropriate or even dangerous to emulate?
Yeah, I think for hobby athletes or amateur athletes, it's very important to focus on their time scaling and on their individual goals, which might be different from rider to rider, but overall the most critical point for an amateur rider, I would say, is the time restrictions, because mostly they are doing this beside their job or studies or depending their family situation. Also a big point or a big topic for a rider who is not fully professional, and with that kind of restrictions, I think it's pretty crucial to monitor the load in a good way and to have a good idea of what is feasible also to afford in a certain time frame.
I think I'm going to try and go through and give amateurs quite an actionable idea of how they can take the best from the World Tour and build their own training plan in this conversation. But I wanted to anchor a few terms because I had a chat with Paul Antoine from Vecta. He actually flew over from Paris to our Dublin studio and got to sit with him for a few hours and drink coffee. And I know you guys are using Vecta internally. And one of the things that's been quite confusing for amateurs and quite confusing for me is we've been so indoctrinated into training peaks, into using chronic training loads, acute training load, training stress balance, TSS as our dominant metrics for building training plans. You've slightly moved away from them now. Can you break down kilocalories and how you're using that to monitor load? Because it goes over a lot of our heads because it's a foreign metric we haven't seen before.
Yeah, I think in general, this kind of monitoring is evolving. So especially with new possibilities of AI and big data computing, I think it has a big chance, and it's also something to look deeper. When we look in the metrics, I mean, in cycling we have the good opportunity to record a lot of data. So with all the kind of devices like power meters, heart rate monitors, but also like HRV bands and stuff like that, we can really look deep into data. But when we take, for example, the power meter data, what you said, it's basically the mechanical energy that we are counting from the power meter unit. And you can relay that also then to the really carbohydrate and fat metabolism being burned and during an endurance ride or intensity ride or whatever. And for us, it's very interesting how much energy is burned in a certain training zone, because the accumulation of that energy is then also related with the adaptations that we are looking for. And so for us, it's really important to get a good scaling on energy expenditure at a certain training zone, which we are looking really deeply when we are training high performance athletes. And that's why I think that's related to your question, why we also want to monitor that and have a really good insight on this topic.
So if we take me as a case study for this hypothetical, How do we go about baselining energy consumption based on zones?
It's depending really the goal of the season that you have and where you're in. But to baseline the energy consumption, first of all, I think the most valuable idea is to go for a lab test first in order to have like a really measurement, because whenever we derive data from pure training data, it's always obvious that this is somehow calculated data and not directly measured. So if you want to really start from a bottom point, I would say the best way to do it is really to have a metabolic test with a spirometry to see really how much carbs and fats you burn at a certain power. And with that knowledge and the fingerprint of your metabolism, you can really dig deeper then into energy consumption, for example, during a race or the demands of a race, and what that might be also related with your body composition and with your metabolism composition especially. And that's how actually it's been done in a professional world. So really looking from the demands of going away from the demands of the race. So for example, you might have an alpine bike marathon or whatever, and then okay, I have to do this kind of altitude meters in climbing, the gradients of the climbs and the overall duration of the event. And with that knowledge, you can then start on thinking with your performance, I might burn on this climbs going on, I don't know, 4.5 watts per kilo. I might burn that and that kind of amount of energy in the different energy systems.
So back in the day, when I say back in the day, up until this conversation, sorry, excuse me, Christian, I'll start that question again. So back in the day, and by back in the day, I mean like 60 minutes ago before we started chatting, my world concept was totally different here. So I would sometimes get into a lab at the start of the season. If I did get into a lab, it would be lactate testing, but more often than not, I wouldn't get into a lab. So I'd use a field test to approximate where my 4 millimoles lactate threshold might be. So I might go out and do, a full 1 hour if I was motivated, a 20-minute test and approximate it at 95%. Or even I know there's other protocols for emerge with like 3 by 8 minute tests and things like that. Is there a way to approximate the fat max, like the distribution of energy in each zone, without getting into a lab?
I mean, you can do this also based on, for sure, any kind of assumptions from power meter data. There are different ways. Either you go in the lactate direction, what you said. So doing, for example, a field lactate test, that could be something, because with available devices to measure lactate, this is also good to do it even alone on a climb, for example. Just to do something like a simulated ramp test and try to calculate out of that LT1 and LT2. I think there might be even some web pages online where you could derive that. And if not, I mean, what you mentioned is the classical FTP test that has been proposed like some years ago already, and derive that, and based on that derive some training zones. It's a pretty easy way, but it also has a big error, because you don't know how much is that athlete really driven from the aerobic or from the anaerobic side. And if you have an idea about that, then you can also take conclusions where might be the threshold, because in the end, both systems are defining where the threshold is really located. And I'm personally working a lot with a metabolic approach, which is based on VO2 max measurements, VLA max as the lactate building rate or lactate production rate, and the threshold, which is then the outcome of that system. And with that, it really also explains pretty good, how an athlete's fingerprint is looking like, and where you might lead up in training in regards of which training methodology, or also which kind of trainings, individual trainings, might make sense for an athlete to move forward.
It's really interesting. So Would I be right in simplifying this to say that the inherent problem with doing a 20-minute test or a lactate test and then approximating all our other zones off this is it doesn't allow for the individual characteristics of a rider? You could take someone from the ultra endurance cycling world, like a Lael Wilcox, who's just finished riding around the world. Maybe she doesn't test super well on a 20-minute test, but she spent hundreds of hours riding zone 1 and zone 2. So she's super well adapted to what we'd expect to see, like using fat as a fuel source and other various adaptations in that zone 1 band.
Yes, exactly, and that's exactly the reason why I said it's if you do it based on one metrics, and it's not an internal metrics in your body, but more an external value like pure power data. You can relate it to, but there is some kind of error in it. If you really try to measure those things, for example, first of all, in a lab situation, then you can get much more accurate data on where might be this fat max, what you have talked of, and which is also now in these days pretty much discussed, the zone 2 training. But there is quite some difference. So from rider to rider, if you really measure it in a lab, you might see that especially the fat metabolism is pretty individual and not always relating to the standard models that might be applied with an FTP and derived zone. So there is some error in it. And so that's why I personally prefer that methodology, like really having a clear setup testing for the anaerobic system and the aerobic. You can also do that with peak power data, but then you have to be a bit more advanced and try to calculate then out of that data the different metabolism systems and get also some insight, which is still based on power data and not internal values. Yeah.
But like, I was shocked when I got into the lab last year with John Wakefield from Red Bull. I think a couple of weeks before that, now I'm kind of fat, I'm like 79, 80 kilograms. So I think the week or 2 weeks before that, I'd ridden like 401 for 20 minutes. And when I got in and done the testing with John, using my normal approximations, I think I was working off like zone 2 starting at 230 watts using the old Andrew Cogan method. But when I got in and John spat out my zones at the end, like, he wanted me doing rides at like 170 watts because I'm a time crunched athlete. I'd effectively got good. I'd hacked the system. I got good at doing 20-minute tests just because I jump on and race my friends and do 10s a lot of time. But aerobically, I was shocking. I was falling apart. So I'd fall apart after like 2 hours on rides, and he just looked at it and he was able to deconstruct and say, you have a huge hole right here, and it's zone 1, zone 2 efficiency levels. Not efficiency levels. My ability to carry out work in zone 1 and zone 2.
Yeah, exactly. That can be exactly related to that, because of, for example, when we go back to the starting point with talking about amateur athletes or also recreational athletes, very often the time frame is very limited. That means you want to get the best out of your training, and it feels just awkward going super easy when you have limited time. So most of them have the tendency to train, in my perspective, too hard in most of their trainings, or in other way around, don't have enough endurance-based training, and give their body also time to recover, and also have a benefit from the training by getting adaptations in. And those are really crucial topics in my point of view. And it's also related then to the outcome, because what we see then when we see lab data is also that mostly this is related with a much more activated glycolysis, so much higher anaerobic system, which is also then depressing for sure the threshold, and also might also lead to what you have said, pretty underperforming aerobic system, and it also in sense of fat max, for example.
So I think that's maybe shift one that I've taken here is amateurs. We're setting up our training zones wrong, and we're not maximizing the adaptations because we don't strictly know what our zones are. We're approximating our zones. If we were to move on past that and kind of layer and build as we go, if you take an amateur who is like almost all of them time restricted in some sense. We'll take someone that's riding 10 to 12 hours a week. How do you think about intensity and distributing intensity across that 10 to 12 hours? Are you an advocate of like the Stephen Saylor method where it's like 80% easy, 20% hard? Or what does your head go to when you're thinking about that distribution?
Yes, I think a pretty robust approach. When we moved back to the older days where it was more or less mainly endurance based, this has shifted to in a direction what you have said, somehow called polarized approach, more in that direction. And I think this approach is pretty robust also for a good variety of riders, which we are talking about when we talk about amateur athletes as well. And so I think that would be a pretty good starting point working off, having a good amount of base work, but also being combined with some race-specific intensity work, especially focusing also when we talk about aerobic enhancements, also with the VO2 max training. And then in the lead up to the goal races, sharpening more with threshold work, and maybe if it's also some kind of more punchy race or criterium or whatever, then also with that kind of sprint specific work. That's for sure a good approach. I'm completely on that, and that is also an approach, a polarized training that is also applied in high performance sports and among different sports, but also in cycling very common to do it like that, because it's a good way to build up the aerobic system.
When we say 80-20, just to clarify on the 20%, are we talking about 20% of our total duration needs to be hard, or 20% of our sessions need to be hard?
That's a bit also, I think there is the understanding, you're right, is not always the same. As far as I would say, it's not that it needs to be on that point of 20%. Normally it's seen on the overall duration. So if you see all the trainings together, then the 20% would be the time to spend at the higher training zones. But it can be also 15-28, and it will be still a good training, or 5% up or down. I think that will not mainly change the impact. It's more about having the consistency and also the quality of the training, being able to stay in zones and not always trying to over push. Because also, for example, a VO2 max training can be either more or less an all-out training for some persons, where it is still a controlled training if you put it in the right borders of the training zone. So that's a bit the direction, I would say. Yeah.
So the 80-20, it shouldn't be taken too literally from reading between the lines from what you're saying. Like if we're in a sprint block and we're training 10 hours a week to make the maths easy, it seems pretty crazy to think I'm going to do 2 hours of sprints inside a full week. So it's quite dependent on what the primary stimulus is during that block, how strictly we adhere to it.
Yes, that's what I said. So if you break it down to a narrow block, then this is probably getting also super intense. So you have to see it more from an overall picture. And when these kind of overall metrics are derived for kind of a consensus on a training concept, it's more seen on, I would say, on a seasonal basis or training period basis. And then it's also incorporating all the training sessions. So, but if you break it down more to one training training week, I would say it's. I would always focus in one session on a main target as a really
like
important,
a primary adaptation.
Yes, exactly. Not to mix too much the different trainings in one session, because you think you might do good by adding more. The only time when this, I think, makes really sense if it's trainings that fit to each other. And also when it's, for example, a kind of simulation day where you might want to add up more fatigue to a rider. in regards of having something like a race simulation, for example, then it might make sense, for example, to start with threshold efforts and adding then a high intensity in the end, because you want to simulate a race in the training. But that's not the common training of a normal day. So normally you would either say, okay, this is a specific endurance training added by something that can be added, for example, short bursts of sprints, fat max intervals in it, or some tempo training can be related to it, some blocks of intervals on that. This, I think, makes really sense. But when you go more specific on the higher training zones, I would tend, especially for amateur athletes, to have this a dedicated training, and then also to shorten the training to really have the impact from that kind of stimulus that you want to have, in sense of mixing it up again with super long ride and then intervals in the beginning, middle, and the end. So I would more tend to the first approach.
Have you tried to watch pro bike racing this season? It's an absolute nightmare. The only thing that's maintained my sanity this season and allowed me to keep following pro cycling, it's Surfshark VPN. With Surfshark, I can set my location virtually anywhere. So geo-blocked content, gone. Whether I'm trying to catch the highlights from Europe, watch the coverage in the US, or follow pro races around the world, Surfshark makes sure I never miss a beat. But that's just the start. It also protects your personal data on public networks. So next time you're sitting in the airport lounge or a cafe trying to upload your Strava file from the day, you're not opening yourself up to hackers and snoopers. One of my favorite features, you can use it across unlimited devices with a single subscription. So I've got it running on my laptop, my phone, my tablet, and Sarah even uses my subscription too. Plus, Surfshark has a clean private search engine called Surfshark Search. No ads, no trackers, just pure results, which is especially handy when I'm researching guests or training topics without being bombarded by pop-ups all the time. And here's the kicker, it's completely risk-free for 30 days with a money-back guarantee. So here's what to do right now. Go to surfshark.com/roadman, or you can use the code ROADMAN at checkout to get an extra 4 months of Surfshark VPN. That's surfshark.com/roadman, and I've dropped the link and the code in the show notes down below. So if we continue with this kind of layered analogy of building up, so we've determined a new way of setting zones. We figured out the distribution of intensity across kind of a macro block. For me, the next logical step in building this out feels like, what type of intensity do we introduce? Do we go with standard periodization, reverse periodization, or randomly allocated intensity based off our goal?
I think in general, there are always different ways to go on. I think there's not one standard way, but having a classical approach to have some kind of build up, and this can be also already polarized, then this makes, especially for an athlete who's lacking in some, on the one hand, in time, that's one limitation factor, and on the other hand also needs to build his systems. I think it's good first to focus on the weak points, which is mostly, and there's the most benefit in, to start off working on the aerobic capacities. So with a zone 2 training, with the endurance blocks, but also for sure can be added already either during in a process or block-wise then in the process, the VO2 max work. There are different approaches in that. Some coaches might tend to say, okay, I don't want to incorporate VO2 max sessions in a traditional classical build-up. Some others say, okay, I want to incorporate it. My personal favor is to incorporate it continuously. So, and I do that also with high performance athletes, that I really try to stimulate the VO2 max regularly, also in endurance training.
So when you move on to monitoring, kind of the effectiveness of these prescriptions. So you're giving out to, one of the riders on the team, Ben O'Connor's going out and doing a long 6-7 hour ride. What metrics matter most during that ride? Heart rate, power? Because a lot of amateurs, our experience on these longer rides is, if 200 watts is my zone 2, I'll start out at 110 beats, but by the end of 6 hours, I'm closer to a zone 3 heart rate than I am zone 2. I've had that aerobic decoupling.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I think, especially when we think on high performance athletes, a lot of preparation work in these days is done in altitude even. And there you have even a more decoupling with the heart rate. Especially when you don't want to cook an athlete in sense of that he can reproduce constantly high quality work, which is mostly the goal, having one, sometimes even 2 sessions per day, then I think it's a mixture of both still, because the power, that's clear, it's reproducible. It's always the same on the planet. 100 watts is 100 watts, but the reaction of the body should be still considered as an external factor to have some guidance for your training. And if the heart rate is then racing too much, especially by being overheated or being in altitude or being just fatigued at the end of the ride, it might make sense really to also reduce the power and not to over too much. I think personally a mixture of having a look on first power, and then secondly to maybe adapt the power data in a training ride by heart rate. That would be my preferred approach.
I know some coaches use like field tests, like sub maximum aerobic field tests to assess the readiness of an athlete to do the session. If an athlete goes out the door and his heart rate is either super suppressed for his zone 2 ride because maybe he's at the end of a long altitude training camp, or it's 10 to 15 beats higher than where it should be, how do you think about, do you have a decision-making metrics where you think maybe I'll adjust this session or maybe I'll can this session totally for the athlete?
Yeah, first of all, you have to be involved at that moment. You are not always with the athlete, so the athlete has also to bring that desire up. I personally, I'm a big fan of the perception of an athlete, because it's still, I think, the highest quality feedback that you can get. So talking with an athlete and then bringing his feeling into a kind of a matrix by giving it, for example, a number or a perceived feeling or whatever. However, you might monitor that in sense of what is this decision taker, if it's a number or a word or whatever, but that should be considered, and that's actually how I work with the athlete. So I'm always scaling from 1 to 10, mostly their feedback, what is their feeling, and then also in individual talks, you get a deeper look. It's not always possible maybe with an amateur athlete, but with a high professional athlete, you can really talk individually very close and work on a daily basis. So then you have a good picture of what could be the cause of this heart rate shift. So it's not always obvious and super easy, but you get a better feeling. And then you can also judge better on if it really makes sense to go harder on that day, or if it would make even sense to skip that training on that day, or just go easier because he might be already too fatigued or whatever. So there is quite some room for interpretation, especially with this heart rate data. That's always also the big discussion point. Is it valid or not? I personally think still that it's a valid metrics, because it's exactly what your body is doing at that moment. And whereas most of the other metrics are more external metrics. So they are super reliable, but the external ones, but the internal ones give you some insight what's really going on. And so it should be considered also for a training decision in my mind. And also athletes see that pretty similar when you talk to them, and it's mostly very easy to find out then with them together what could be the reason and what they feel in this moment, and then you can also move forward with your decision-taking process.
And kind of extending from that, how do we know when it's time to sack off an interval session? And I think this is maybe more relevant for amateur athletes than it is for World Tour athletes, because oftentimes you're carrying stress into a session, whether it's a long day at work, compromised night's sleep. So you get out to do the session, you have 4 by 4 minutes VO2 max prescribed. You're really motivated because you're super focused on your goals, even though cycling is not the main thing. It's not what puts bread on the table. You're super motivated. Maybe you're a Cat 2, Cat 1 rider chasing an objective. You see quitting a session as almost a sign of weakness. But what are the guardrails where you think you're no longer getting value from this session? You're contributing fatigue without contributing adaptation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because the tendency of doing more because you're motivated is always there in high performance sports and also in amateur sports. And that's mostly also one of the big mistake points, to really overdo in sessions and to build up a lot of fatigue with that, because actually what we aim for in a high performance sport is really to cross with a certain training, for example, a VO2 max training, to cross the borders of where adaptations are released. And that's pretty average or medium level of fatigue where you already get adaptations out. And then there is maybe a zone where you could still improve by doing a bit more. But then comes just a big zone of adding just more fatigue and not much more benefit in the adaptations. And what I said before, even a multi training on a day, like 2 trainings or even 3 trainings in some sports are done per day. And we see also that there's a lot of benefit in doing it by adding up extra adaptations. And that's why I personally would say it's always better to not kill yourself in the training completely, and leave some room. This might be some kind of a perception thing. Also, not every athlete feels it the same, but to really have the tendency not to go all out always. Not every interval session is aiming for that, actually. And I know there are these kind of power meter related targets. And when you drop this kind of percentage in the next interval, then it's time to stop or something like that. But it's all already related to quite high fatigue levels, because when you start dropping, you're pretty much done all you could do before already. Sometimes this might be the wish from a coach. But for me personally, it's more or less mostly in none of the sessions. This is the major target. So I would also really encourage the amateur athletes to really say, okay, not trying to aim for the 3rd, 4th, 5th series. So just focusing on good quality. And when you have a perception, for example, when you rate it from 1 to 10, 1 is super easy and 10 is all out. When you cross some thresholds, being at 7, 8 already from a perception, this is already a quite tough session. And in most of the cases, this is already releasing the adaptations that we are really aiming for. And there's no need to add up that extra fatigue, especially when you're an amateur athlete and you have not the sleep time. Sometimes you reduce even sleep because you want to extend the training in the evenings and stuff like that. So then I think this is exactly the point, that, and this kind of perception could really help amateur athletes to be also then happy with that session still, because you think, okay, I achieved that kind of internal metrics that I have, and that's maybe good to keep it like that, and not aim for another session.
Roadman, whether you're a weekend warrior or a world tour rider, the right tools can make all the difference. Enter 4i's Precision 3 Plus Power Meter, the latest innovation from 4i, designed to help you reach peak performance. The Precision 3 Plus Power Meter is a compact yet powerful unit. It weighs just 9 grams and it's packed with features that set it apart, including integration with Apple's Find My network, giving you the peace of mind by letting you track your power meter wherever it is. Plus, you've got up to 800 hours of battery life. We all know that accuracy is key, and 4Eyes delivers a groundbreaking plus or minus 1% accuracy thanks to their unique 3D strain gauge technology. For those seeking even more data, the Precision 3 Plus Pro Power Meter offers dual-sided power meter metrics, giving you detailed insights into pedaling efficiency, torque effectiveness, and left-right balance. 4Eyes offers versatile product options to suit your needs. Choose from ride-ready power meters with pre-installed units on Shimano cranks, or up for factory-installed power meter where you send in your crankset for a custom installation. Ready to elevate your cycling game? Trust 4Eyes Precision 3 Plus Power Meter. Precision, performance, and peace of mind all in one. Learn more by visiting 4iiii.com. That's 4iiii.com. I'm going to put that in the description down below. So would you almost benchmark an RPE against a particular session type? So if I go out the door and for me, 2 20-minute threshold efforts are normally a 7 out of 10 effort. If I'm 10 minutes into my threshold effort and all of a sudden RPE is risen to 9, that's a sign that I'm accumulating fatigue.
I would say within that effort, I wouldn't see that, but piling up, stocking up with more intervals, then I would see it more from that side. You really, because in an interval you have a target at the end of a VO2 max, for example, on-off intermittent interval like 40-20s or whatever you might aim for. For sure, the second last and the last repetition will feel hard to somehow super hard. Or whatever, and this is normal. So I think that is also the goal. But adding up then more fatigues with more series at a certain point, you should really consider how you feel overall in that session, and if that makes sense to add up then another one. If you want to go with if you're more the numbers based guy and you really focused on the power number, for sure also you can work with drop-offs in power data. But as I said, this is then also very much depending what kind of efforts you are aiming for. If you're really aiming for short efforts, then there's already quite some variation in the interval to interval data. If you aim for longer sessions, you can set the margins then to a smaller barrier, and this can be also something. But I personally really would prefer, setting not too high benchmarks for that, because that will mostly lead just to over fatigue in the end.
What I've anecdotally observed from riders that I am coaching amateur level, it's frequency. If we look at it, zoom out, frequency seems to be what determines their long-term success or failure. The people who can train more often typically perform better. The one thing that typically undermines frequency and causes it to fall off is intensity. So whenever I see a rider with a 10 out of 10 training block, I feel like I'm looking at a rider who's about to have a 2 out of 10 training block. A 10 out of 10 is about to become a 2 out of 10, whereas an 8 out of 10 seems to be replicatable over a very long period of time.
Yes, yeah. I mean, then we are back to what we said before with a perception also of the riders. But as I said, so this might be also pretty individual. The second topic also related to that is also for sure, how often do you apply that during a week? And if you want to really improve and you're motivated, for sure, if you're not controlled by any coach or just self-coach, then the tendency of adding too much interval sessions can be another topic. To add just more fatigue and maybe don't get the benefits then over the time. But I think it should be a good balance, especially as we are talking about athletes who are not having the recovery that a pro athlete is having in the end.
But where does it break down? Because we've seen a lot of coaching companies in the last 10 years pushing this marketing message of, if you're time crunched, you need to turn that intensity. So if we think about, we have a frequency lever, we have a duration lever, and we have an intensity lever. So for amateur athletes, we can't really pull the frequency lever. We can't pull the duration lever. So people that are time crunched, like I'm talking, working long hours in work, family, and they're saying, hey, I only have 6 hours a week where I can ride my bike, or I only have 5 hours a week where I can ride my bike. They seem to just yank more and more on the intensity lever. How do you think about building a training plan or distribution wise for someone who is so time crunched?
Yes, I mean it's always a bit depending also the basis the athlete brings along. So if he has been already longer in sport and coming from different sports, or even in his young years being competitive sport, it's a bit of a different situation than if somebody starts as a beginner. All these kind of high intensity approaches, for sure, especially when you're a beginner, have also a big impact on endurance. They have a big impact on maximum power. They have a big impact basically on everything, because you're starting with that, and they will level up your whole system. But it brings
those
also
newbie gains.
Yes, exactly. And it brings also, when you just focus on that high intensity training, I think there are quite some downsides also, because in the end, this kind of overuse or accumulated fatigue problems that come up with it, especially when it's not correctly monitored, can have also pretty negative impact. And in the end, it's about having fun and doing the sport that you like to do. When you're an amateur athlete, even as a pro, you should aim for that. And when you're then just killing yourself with this kind of training methodology, I think it's not what you personally are looking for. So I think a good mix of endurance and high intensity work can be something to, especially for people who are having not much time, and have some restrictions there, to get out the best thing for them. The most common problem I see there is that a lot of athletes are pretty much training in the mixed zone. So they are not training zone 2, they are not training low endurance, they are not really working on specific above threshold work, but they are just pushing the pedals. And that's mostly below threshold, but above fat max. So it's a bit in that mixed metabolism zone. And that leads to fast adaptations, and you can push then, I don't know, a certain speed of your training group, but there's a quick stagnation with that, and then you're just not leveling up anymore. And because you're not training your cardiovascular system in a way as if you would do it with a classical polarized approach with VO2 max and fat max endurance training. And with that, I think, this is really something what amateur athletes should consider to pay a focus on, not just ride your bike and go hard in that nowhere land, I would say a bit, make it more specific, and you will get a better outcome. Yeah.
Christian, thank you so much for your time today. I think it's been really helpful for amateur athletes to get some guardrails and some signposts to figuring out what the World Tour guys are doing and what we can be doing, which is dangerous and helpful from that.
Thank you very much for having me here, and all the best.